uh, have your lab reports at the end of the hour. The results of the Friday laboratories are here for the PM and the AM. You should have now in your hands the lab outlines through number 10. These papers that you got today are a collection of outlines going up through the laboratory number 10. You should also have the lecture outlines through 7 and 8. That's the lecture that we're just about to start today. And last time I gave you the date the lab reports are due outline, and if you didn't get it, why, you can get it from Mr. Weaver or Mr. Fong over in Enology Building. Now, the references on French wines, which we're going to be talking about today and Friday, are not very good. Johnson's book has a lot of fact as well as fable in it. Same thing is true of Simon's book. I'd appreciate it if you don't take out books on French wines at the present time so that the whole class can use them. Otherwise, I've got to go over and put a lot of books on reserve, some of which will be used and some of which won't be used. So if you want to look at these books, just use them in the library, and we won't have to put them on reserve. Now, there's a lot of mystique, I've called it here, or a certain amount of snobism, and certainly a lot of romance about French wines. Just quickly reviewing the Vit 3 material, it's the largest consuming country in the world. It doesn't make as much wine as Italy, but it almost makes as much wine as Italy. It's certainly second or third largest acreage in the world, grapes. It has more different types of wine than any other country, probably a greater range of quality than any other country. It is a country that is obsessed almost with its own image of what the wines of France mean to the French people. Even the lowliest peasant considers that the wines of France are a part of his French heritage, and that France is great partially because it produces French wines. That whether that's true or not, that's the impression you get. And I think it is undoubtedly true. We don't quite know why this is true. Why should the French, of all the people of Europe, have developed this almost worship of the vine and worship of things connected with the vine? It wasn't always true. During the Dark Ages, the wines of Spain, the wines of Italy, the wines of Cyprus, Madeira, Crete, were all better known in Northern Europe than French wines were, and were all highly praised. I think that was because in that period of time people were interested in a considerable amount of alcohol in the wines, and those wines all had more alcohol than French wines. It wasn't really till after the Louis started in that French wines began to be developed as a very special thing of France. And it proceeded in all the areas somewhat independently of each other, because Eastern France was Burgundian, Southern France was English, and the French monarchy had a special relationship to the Champagne district. So that each in their own ways gradually developed this tradition of winemaking, and it actually reached its peak in around 1870. There were more grapes made at that time than any time in French history. I've already covered in Viticulture 3 the impact of phylloxera on this industry, and I won't repeat that except to say that it had some good things happen to it as well. It forced a whole new relationship to the variety picture. All the vineyards having been pulled out because they were dead, and putting them back, they put them back primarily with good varieties. It doesn't take very long to debase a good vineyard. it happened here in California during Prohibition. The only grapes that would ship east were Alicante Bouchers and so forth, thick-skinned varieties with lots of color. They were gradually interplanted in the Napa Valley. And you can still see vineyards with red-leafed grapes in them in September and October. Those are the interplants of the Prohibition period just in Napa Valley. So in a period of only 20 years, there was a large implanting of new varieties. Well, this probably happened many times in the past in France, so that phylloxera in that respect had a very good effect on the planting of grapes. And furthermore, it straightened out the rows. It didn't do anything else. Before 1870, the hoe was the primary method of cultivating vineyards. After that, oxen were used, horses were used, and later, of course, machines were used. And that, of course, made for better production, less work, and so forth. Now, I've also taken up the question of appellation contrôlée for French wines in Vit 3, and I will not repeat that material here, except to say that it limits the areas specifically. It limits the varieties that can be planted, and the varieties are listed, plus they're synonyms in some cases, so there can be no doubt about what they're talking about. Some varieties are listed for early retirement. That is, they will give you a few years in which to take out the variety. The Gamay in the Champagne district was such a variety. The first laws of appellation, modern appellation of origin for Champagne were 1928. It was not till 1960 that the last Gamays were officially pulled out. And I have no doubt there's still a few Gamay vineyards in the southern part of the Champagne district. They limit the production per acre, and in general this is a pretty good rule, I think. And as I said to the class the other day, looking at some of the pruning practices this year, I'm sorry that we don't have a maximum production per acre for California. The French, being very pragmatic people, not only limited the production per acre, but they put a minimum alcohol content on the wine, so that even if they tried to cheat one way, they're going to get caught up the other way, because the more they put on it, the less sugar content they're going to have, therefore the less alcohol they're going to have. Now, the appellation of origins has been considerably strengthened by the European Common Market, what is called in Europe the ECC, or what we call the ECM, European Common Market. And the strength of it has become greater now because England has and Ireland have joined the common market, and presumably all the wines that go into those countries will have to comply with some sort of appellation of origin. What the European Common Market does very quickly is that they agree to abide by each other's naming practices, so that if Italy does not register by a certain time schedule Chianti in the European Common Market, anybody can use it. So there is this great mad rush in the producing countries of Europe to register all the possible geographical appellations that they might want to use for the future. And they're all very busy in the process of that at the present time. This is further strengthened by what's called the Madrid-Lisbon agreements. The Madrid Convention was in 1888. The Lisbon Convention was about 1958, and both of these agree that countries will not use other countries' geographical names for agricultural products, so that Norman butter cannot be produced in Holland, and Burgundy wine cannot be produced in the Rhone, and Bordeaux wine cannot be produced in Alsace, and so forth. These have assumed a very big importance under the European Common Market. Well, let me say a few more words now about the climatic conditions. I just was reading the other day an article by Prescott from Australia. It's really pretty cold in France. These are the average mean temperatures for the warmest months in these different districts. So you see that Bordeaux is just about, the mean daily temperature in August is just about 68 degrees centigrade. And here in Burgundy, it's about the same. It's a little cooler than that up here in Alsace, and it's also cooler over here in Chablis and Champagne. And the really warm districts are down here next to the Mediterranean, in the far south. So France in general is an area of rather cool climatic conditions. You can see how cool it is if you take 20 degrees, 68, less 15, that's 18 for the hottest month, is only 540 degrees for the hottest month. So all the other months, the other 3 or 4 growing months, are going to be much less than that. Perhaps only 400 or 300 degree days or day degrees. So that this is surely only region 1 and barely region 1. And these are only occasionally in region 2 for California conditions. The Loire here, which we think of as being the garden of France and so forth, the Loire is between 1 and 2. Some years it's 2 and some years it's 1. Well, the variety of grapes planted has changed after phylloxera, and it's still changing today. It's changing by the elimination of some varieties and by clonal selection of other varieties to get higher production. When we talk about Germany next Monday, I'll have something to say about the importance of clonal selection. One of the defects of appellation of origin, and I hope we don't get that in California, is that once you set up an appellation of origin for a region and you list the varieties, it takes an awful lot of effort to get any new varieties on the list. So about the only 2 things you can do to improve the varietal plantings of a region is 1, to eliminate the bad varieties, or 2, to find better producing clones or more resistant clones or easier to prune clones of varieties that are already approved. The idea of bringing in a new variety from outside would require all kinds of congresses and investigations and experimentation and a hearing in the courts, and finally it would have to go to the Chamber of Deputies and be made into a new law for that district. I hope we don't get to be that difficult in California. If and when we do have appellations of origin in California, I hope that some mechanism will be built into it so that new varieties can be brought into the district. The encépagement, they call this the encépagement, or the mixture of varieties. That's what that French word means. The mixture of varieties for the region doesn't change very much within short periods of time. The encépagement of Burgundy is about 100 years old now. Hasn't changed very much for 100 years. That of Bordeaux has changed more in the last 100 years than Burgundy has. There's been more change in Bordeaux. The change in the Alsace has been very rapid in the last 25 years. So Alsace, being a relatively young region, has had very rapidly changing selection of varieties, just now coming into an appellation controllee. The Loire hasn't really created very many appellation controllee yet. They have them, but they've not been worked on as much as they should be, so they don't have as much reputation. They could probably be worked on a lot more. All right, so much then for the variety planting. The climatic conditions I've emphasized already. France was very proud at the turn of the century of not only being the largest producing country in the world at the turn of the century, since they've since lost that to Italy, but nevertheless they're very close together, but it was also very proud of themselves as the scientific masters of winemaking because of Louis Pasteur. And that feeling that the French know the answers continues today. One of the most difficult problems you have if you travel in scientific laboratories in France is the game of one-upsmanship that they play. Well, after all, it's French, therefore it has to be the best. Nobody's going to tell us from California or Germany or Russia or any place what's best. We know the best. We've been in it the longest. Look, we had Louis Pasteur. And they are still bragging about that. They're paying the way of a number of people from all over the world in May to France to talk about Louis Pasteur and French wines and French enology at the expense of the French government. So this is it's what they believe, and it's actually what the government sponsors. And that one time they did supply a good part of the equipment. They had more textbooks than any other country had, and better textbooks, I would say, than except a few French ones. Certainly a lot better textbooks than the Italians had at that period of time. Just book for book, quoting one from the other. The firm of Dujardin Saint-Laurent produced and still produced right up till after the First World War more laboratory equipment for wineries than all the rest of the laboratories in the world put together. Everybody had a Dujardin Saint-Laurent abuleometer in American wineries. It was the most popular one. And this was true all over the world. So the French technically consider themselves to be the standard, but it isn't true anymore. And it's unfortunately not true because of the Industrial Revolution and the modern technical revolution simply passed them by. While they were bragging about how good Pasteur was, a lot of other new equipment came in and so forth. The Germans, for example, and the Italians together took about 2/3 of all the winery equipment business in the last 50 years, away from the French. It's only within the last couple of years that the new Coke presses have been developed to the point that people are beginning to use them. And that's practically the only contribution in winery practice that the French have really made in the last few years. They resisted, for example, in the Champagne district for more than 50 years after the Germans and the Swiss had discovered the virtues of glass-lined tanks or lined tanks for white wines. The Champagne district completely resisted it till well after World War II and continued to use 50-gallon barrels, which are wasteful and cause lots of losses and so forth. At the present time, there's only one winery that has any wooden barrels in it in the whole Champagne district. Everything has been converted in the last 10 years. But that was 20, 30 years too late. And so the Champagne quality suffered from that during that particular period of time. Why then does their commercial success continue? It's a very good question, because we'd like to get into this deal also. Well, they play in tradition, first of all. We are French. We know better than anybody else how to make wines. They have used the appellation of origin very effectively. I think there's no doubt that the fact that the government itself guarantees that if you buy a Bordeaux wine, it comes from Bordeaux. The prestige of the French government is behind it. Adds a lot of confidence to wine drinkers all over the world. And since most other countries do not guarantee in the same way, right down to the vineyard in some cases, and certainly down to the village in other cases, that has given them a lot of prestige and given a lot of consumers confidence. I think that also the French have been very good in tasting their own wines. I think that the French and Americans have been worse on French wines than the Frenchmen themselves. It was the Americans that announced that 1959 was this year of the century, and that the greatest wines ever produced in France will be 1959. That was all because two importers got stuck with an awful lot of 1959 wines, and they had to get rid of them some way. So they advertised widely. They got a lot of their friends to say that the 59s were the greatest wines of the century. And 2 years later, the 61 came along, which was almost twice as good in some areas, and they were sort of stuck at that stage. Whereas the French people were looking at it very moderately and saying, well, 59 is a very good year, it's a millésime, and so forth, but we've seen years like it before, and we'll see years like it again. And the English have done some of the same kind of tricks as that. So that this ability to look at their product with cold commercial eyes is, I think, an advantage of the French wine industry. And then, of course, their climatic conditions do permit them to produce a large number of types of wines. They have a wide variety of climates, and they've made full use of these, and still are. Well, I propose now to take a little time for Bordeaux and a little time for Burgundy perhaps today, and then take care of all the other parts of the district of the country next time. First thing about Bordeaux is I can never understand why people compare Bordeaux wines with California Cabernet. That's a misconception that has grown and has now gotten to the point of where the industry holds tastings with Bordeaux wines, comparing them with California Cabernets. First of all, Cabernet represents only a small part of the Bordeaux and Cepagement. There are very few vineyards that have even 50% Cabernet Sauvignon in the Bordeaux district. So Bordeaux is not, per se, Cabernet Sauvignon. It's a mixture, as you know from Vit 3, of Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Malbec, Merlot, Petit Verdot, and several other small amounts of other varieties, even including Saint Macaire in the Entre-deux-Mers district. At any rate, that's one difference between the two of them, which would preclude, it would seem to me, the comparison. But the other and worse difficulty is that they're not the same kind of wine. Bordeaux wines, in general, run around 10, 10.5, occasionally 11% alcohol. A California Cabernet with less than 12% alcohol is considered to be very thin. Well, when you consider what the difference of 1% alcohol, that's 10% difference in alcohol. If it's 10 and 11%, for example. And these are a little bit less than that. That's a big difference in alcohol. And it makes a lot of difference in the extract. It makes a lot of difference in softening off the acid taste. California Cabernets, because of their higher alcohol, always taste much softer and so forth. So you can take either one of them as the standard. That's not the point. They're just not comparable. If you use California standards to judge French Bordeaux, then the French Bordeaux are going to be very thin. If you use French standards to judge California Cabernets, then California Cabernets are Algerian monstrosities with too much alcohol in them and too flat and not enough color in many cases. So that I think that's the difference, that they differ in style, they differ in fact. They're not the same. Now the soils, a few years ago the French decided to put a full-time man on Bordeaux soils, and his name was Seguin. He's published several articles now. He shows pretty definitely that there is no one type of soil in the Bordeaux region, that even in one district there are several types of soils, that the best soils of the Bordeaux region were the well-drained soils. The best vineyards, the ones with the higher alcohol content, the one with the more moderate acidity, the ones that were running 11, 11.5 instead of 10, 10.5 alcohol were the ones that were the best. They also showed that there was some retention of moisture in the good soils, that they did not dry completely out. The Graves district, for example, which is largely very gravelly, doesn't retain the moisture and also gets waterlogged at a very narrow limit in some cases, so that you flood the water or it's too dry, and you have this, in one case, the flooded soil, the roots growth is restricted. In the other case, it gets very dry and root growth is also restricted. Similarly, to finish up about that alcohol, the great period of Bordeaux wines was supposed to be in the period between 1860 and 1870. And we now have analysis of those wines. Most of the wines were only 9% of alcohol. So the idea of what is a great Bordeaux has changed in the last 100 years. 100 years ago, they were quite willing to drink Bordeaux wines at lower alcohols than they do today. That has to do, I think, with the technical improvements. They do have summer rainfall, and it's a major problem. 1964, the fungus got worse and worse. Finally, some people in desperation picked the 1964 crop before the middle of October, and they made some fair but light wines. The people who did not pick by that, they had to wait 2 weeks before they could get in the vineyards, and all, which represents about almost 2/3 of all the Bordeaux chateaus, made very thin wines. They had to take them off the skins very quickly. They had to pasteurize some of them because of the polyphenol oxidase content that was turning them brown. And some of the wines of the 1964 crop have been aging and they're already ready to drink or should be drunk already. Botrytis is the major one of the fungus problems. What's very good in the Sauterne district is very bad in the red wine districts, which are the main wines of the region. As a matter of fact, just last year in a symposium in France, they said that botrytis is the major viticultural problem of France. I think that's maybe more true in California than we've been giving it credit for. There's been a lot of botrytis. You remember the Martini report on fungus diseases of the Napa Valley. Mrs. Martini and her husband made a survey of this and published it in the American Journal of Enology a few years ago. They showed that botrytis in many cases was above 10% of the crop of the grapes picked late in the season in the Napa Valley. And I'm sure in some cases that was not desirable. Maybe in the whites, yes, but not in the reds. Now the next problem, which I did not take up in Viticulture 3, is why the mixture of varieties in Bordeaux. This has fascinated a lot of people, and nobody really has the best answer. Peynaud, who's a big expert in the Bordeaux Agricultural Experiment Station, published a report some years ago based on the vintages of 1958 and 59, in which he said that the situation might be something like this: that the Cabernet Sauvignon was a high tartaric acid variety, and Malbec was a high malic acid variety. And that turns out to be true. It's true in California also. The largest percentage of the acidity of Cabernet Sauvignon is tartaric acid, and in Malbec it's malic acid. And that's easy to remember because the malic goes with the Malbec, you see, so you don't have to think very hard on that. Now in a hot year, you need the Cabernet Sauvignon because it retains its tartaric acid and it loses malic acid. So in order to keep the wine from being very flat, you need to have these two balanced wine. In a hot year, high tartaric acid would be desirable. It would have a very good balance and so forth, and you'd be all right. In the cool year, however, the high tartaric acid variety would be too acid because it would retain all of its tartaric acid. You would also retain some malic, but then you have the malolactic fermentation to reduce the malic acid. So in the cool year, the Malbec is necessary to give you a high malic acid variety, which with the malolactic fermentation will reduce the acidity down, will buffer the pH up as it forms more and more lactic acid. And so you'll go from a high malic acid to the very weak acid, lactic acid, and the whole thing will be smoothed off. Now that was Peynaud's theory, and to a certain extent I bought that theory, and I'm sorry that Peynaud left me in the lurch because he's now said that it doesn't work this way all the time, that there are some cases that he can't explain when they don't fall in these categories. But I think it's a first indication is that in the Bordeaux district they plan a mixture of varieties so that they will have a better balance of acidity from year to year. That I think is correct. And just how it actually operates in a given mixture, nobody has done the necessary biochemical research. But the premise is generally correct. And it may be that in some cases in California, to produce a higher quality wine from year to year, we may find it desirable to blend varieties with different amounts of malic and lactic acid for the future. I haven't tried the new Cabernet varieties, measured their tartaric and malic acid contents, but I hope somebody has, because it's certain that the best varieties in the San Joaquin Valley are going to be high tartaric acid varieties. And so if they have a high tartaric acid variety, that will certainly be useful. The Cabernet Sauvignon is a high color variety, primarily because of its very small size of berries and therefore a large surface to volume relationship. So that, and as you know, Dr. Singleton's been working on this and showing that this is a fact, that if you add more skins to the juice, you'll get more tannin, you'll get more color, and you'll get more flavor the more skins you have. So with the small berried Cabernet Sauvignon, you get more flavor. It also has the advantage that it's pretty fungus resistant. Only 1 year since, I guess we had the Federal Vineyard before we had the Oakville Vineyard. So in 38 years, only 1 year in all that time have we seen mold on Cabernet Sauvignon in the middle of the Napa Valley. That's pretty good, once out of 38 times. We've seen mold on other varieties every other year. Cabernet Franc has been adequately tested in California and has been adequately tested in the Soviet Union and in Bulgaria, of all places. It's lower in color and lower in flavor. It does not produce any more than Cabernet Sauvignon, and it's just as much trouble to train as Cabernet Sauvignon. So that we see no reason for planting Cabernet Franc in California. It matures a little earlier than Cabernet Sauvignon, which might have some advantages for some people. And for some unknown reason, it does predominate in Saint-Emilion. But the other districts, it's a minor variety. The Merlot has become more popular in this century. Malbec was popular in the previous century. Now the Merlot has come to the front. Merlot, the amount that's used, in some areas you can't find it. In other areas and vineyards, it accounts for as much as 75% of the total blend. It looks like and tastes like some sort of sport or clonal selection from Cabernet. The leaves are more entire, but the clusters have the same general straggly look of Cabernet Sauvignon. And in general, I would say that you would guess it more often than not to be a Cabernet in blind tasting. But it has slightly larger berries and slightly thinner skin. So with the larger berries and the thinner skin, you don't get quite as much Cabernet flavor, and it is more subject to fungus diseases. There was some rot in Merlot this year, for example, which was not an extraordinarily wet year. The Malbec, as much as 33% is used in a few areas, but in general the Malbec has not been as successful in this century as it was in the last century. We don't quite know why this is. Our own experience with Malbec, which is more than 30 years now, is that we have had a very hard time getting good clonal selections. We've had one of them that was virus infected. We had another one that had some sort of defect in flowering. I think altogether we've gone through 3 clones in California. The same thing is true in Australia also. They complain about the Malbec clones not being normal and so forth. It does have some Cabernet flavor, and as you might expect, it is very subject to malolactic fermentation. We had difficulty when we grew Malbec here at Davis in preventing the malolactic fermentation. The problem of this mixture of varieties is, of course, that they don't all ripen at the same time. Cabernet Sauvignon ripens after Merlot. Cabernet Franc ripens before Cabernet Sauvignon. So that you've got to go through the vineyard twice, or you've got to pick one a little too ripe if the other one is going to be ripe, or you've got to pick one ripe and the other a little too green. The new tendency has been, in the last 10 years, to plant the varieties in solid blocks and pick them at different times and then blend the wine afterward. This defeats a little bit of the purpose of the malolactic fermentation, but I think is more rational in one sense, that you don't have to go through the vineyard 3 times to pick the grapes. Up until 1964, at Chateau Latour, one of the better and bigger chateaus in the Bordeaux district, they had to pick the whole vineyard 3 different times, because there would be a vine of Cabernet here, a vine of Merlot over there, and a vine of Malbec over there. Well, this increased the cost of picking tremendously, and the net result was that they decided to change it. They pulled out 1/4 the vineyard every year for 4 years and replanted the whole vineyard in blocks. and that allows them to pick each variety at its optimum maturity, and it also gives them the option of making the blend in whatever way they want. In some years they might use more of the Cabernet. I would think in the hot years, and in some of the cool years they might use more of the Malbec. And then sell the rest of the wine as Bordeaux wine, not as the commune wine, but just sell it as Bordeaux Red or Medoc Red, something like that. Those of you who haven't had Vit 3 had better read that chapter on Bordeaux districts. It's still an area of large estates in general, with some few exceptions. The cooperative system has been quite popular, and so there are quite a number of large cooperative wineries for the small producers. And in general, they've kept the large shippers. Now, the district is in the process of change right now. The big shippers are having a hard time getting enough wine to sell. The chateaus can sell all their wine by themselves. They don't need the shippers anymore to ship the wine to Hong Kong or Singapore or San Francisco. They can ship it there themselves. All they have to do is pick up a phone and call San Francisco and say, do you want 50 cases of Chateau Margaux? And the answer is yes. They don't need to go through Cruce Fils or Echenal or any of the other big shippers that they used to deal with. And there may be some very big changes take place in Bordeaux in the near future. Mouton Ratio, for example, has decided now to, since their name is worth so much, they're going to put out a whole line of Bordeaux wines under the name Mouton Cadet and distribute it itself worldwide. Just one chateau. They're really taking the place of the shipper. Now, I said in Vit 3 that the classification of 1855, that was a commercial classification that classified about 55 of the best Bordeaux chateaux into categories 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I said in Vit 3 that was out of date, and perhaps out of date with the times as well. It was based upon the prices that were paid for these 55 or 60 chateaux in 1855. It had been based upon two previous classifications of the wines of Bordeaux, so it was not a new idea. It meant a tremendous amount of money, however, to the four wineries that were classified number 1. Their prices have always been from 10 to 25% more than any other chateaus. They're guaranteed a sale every year, even during the Depression years when they were having a hard time giving away wine in Bordeaux. The big chateaus maintained their prices pretty well. The price of some chateaus is more than twice that of the next chateau on the list. In Sauternes, for example, Chateau d'Yquem regularly sells at 50% more than the next highest quality. This is what I call the snobism of the French scene, but it's also one of the results of the 1855 classification. There doesn't seem to be much hope of changing it. The people who got the classification number 1 or number 2 or number 3 are not going to give it up. And so that I don't see any really possibility. But it's all wrong, of course. First of all, the chateaus are not in the same places in some cases. Just because it says Chateau Margaux doesn't mean it's the same Chateau Margaux that was there in 1855. In fact, they took a whole chateau right next to Chateau Margaux and combined it with Chateau Margaux in the 1950s. So that's not the same. Chateau Lascombe moved across the road most of its vineyard. They also bought out another chateau and put the vineyard of that chateau with theirs. Sometimes the chateau properties are not all even contiguous. They'll have some a half mile down the road, and they'll have some around the chateau, or some not even very close to the chateau. The winemakers have all changed. Chateau Haut-Brion, which was a very famous chateau in 1855, eventually passed to an American family who still own it, the Dillon family of Philadelphia. They had bad luck between 1920 and 1928. They got a winemaker who didn't know the difference between milk and wine. And he made bad wines. When everybody else was making good wines in 1924, and in 1920 and 21, to a lesser extent in 22, he was making just awful wines. Just didn't pay attention, and wines got high in volatile acidity. He pressed them off the skins too soon, and it was not until The Dillons sent one of their nephews there that after 1928 that they got the whole estate back under control again. And besides that, the whole idea of the chateaus has changed. In the early days, they never declared a vintage unless it was good. There were no vintages at Chateau Lafite from 1871 till 1893, a period of 22 years. That the wines were just not that good. The Rothschilds could afford not to have a vintage, so they just sold all the Chateau Lafite wine and went into Bordeaux Red and Bordeaux and Medoc Red. That's not true anymore. We don't have that kind of idealist around the world anymore. Chateau Lafite, 1963, which was a perfect disgrace, awful wine, spoiled wine and so forth, sold at $16 a bottle on the American market 2 years ago. And the Americans drank it. And before you get any inferiority complex, the big Camino de Oro Hotel in Mexico City sold it at $25 a bottle and had even the Mexicans drinking it at that price. So don't think that we're worse off than other people. It's true that some Bordeaux chateaus did not ship 63 as a vintage, and also 65 was pretty generally skipped over. So there has been some attempt to maintain standards, but it varies from chateau to chateau. Pinot, starting in the 1958-59 when they were doing these same experiments, also was working on time of pressing. At the same time that Professor Berg was working on the same subject here. It's rather interesting that they came to the same conclusions in the early 1960s that you could press off the wine earlier, between 6 and 9 bricks, without having a low color content, but that you would reduce the tannin content by such early pressing. Had the same results in Bordeaux as here. And therefore, you would be better off if you wanted early maturing wines to press them in that range. And that's about 2/3 of the chateaus now are pressing in the 6 to 9 barreling area. This means that they only need 2 years of aging before they go on the market. It saves them the 3rd year, which was traditional before 1960. So now you can get already the 1970 wines are on the market. By the summer of 73, the 1971 wines will be on the market. So they'll have just a little bit less than 2 years in the wood. Some of the chateaus have resisted this, about 1/3 of them have, and they're still fermenting them down to 1 to 2 bricks and getting more tannin, and then using 3 years of wood aging before they do the bottling. There's a lot of temperature control of fermentations going on now. That's a new development. And bentonite has gone through the same cycle there as it did here. In 1935, when Sewell first came out with bentonite on the American market, there were any number of people in the North Coast that said, "Oh, bentonite, that's an inorganic material that'll spoil the wine." Well, in Bordeaux, Ribrogallon and Pinot said, "Well, bentonite, it has an earthy character." Well, we made some experiments at that time. We extracted bentonite with water, concentrated the water, and then gave them tap water to see if they could tell it apart. And aside from a little aeration that had gone through the filtration and so forth, we couldn't find any taste in bentonite. The bentonite is pretty neutral material, especially if you use a mixture of sodium and calcium bentonite. So that nobody thinks of adding charcoal to bentonited wines that Ribrogallon preached at one time to take away the bentonite flavor. And they're using bentonite as the primary fining agent in France now, just like it is in California, and it's also the primary fining agent in Germany at the present time. The 59 gallon pièce or barrel is the standard Bordeaux container, and if you can afford it, the new ones. But the new ones are for a different reason, I think. I can't prove this. I wish I could prove it. I don't think it's because they get a better quality of tannin extraction and so forth. I think it's just because there is no thing that's been constructed by human beings that's harder to take care of and keep clean than a 50-gallon barrel. it will spoil while you're turning around. And I think the reason they use new cooperage is to keep from using spoiled barrels. And just takes one spoiled barrel, dilute it out, and you can taste it a mile off even though you put 50 good barrels on top of it. It's pretty hard to dilute out a moldy barrel smell. And I've had enough Bordeaux wines now that have not been in new cooperage, that have had this cask character, that my guess is that that's the reason why the rich chateaus prefer to have new cooperage each year, because they never have a moldy barrel that way. They're always using new, clean oak barrels. But I don't think it's because it has any particular effect on the quality per se. It has an effect, of course, on the quality because of this fact that it's just almost impossible to keep a 50-gallon barrel without spoilage. You put SO2 in it, you get spongy wooden sides of the barrels and so forth. Fill it with lime water, it'll eventually rot. If you leave it empty, the barrel will fall apart. Anybody that's got a new idea of how to keep a 50-gallon barrel absolutely clean without any harmful ingredients, HEW or anything else, will have the world by the tail. Really. You'd be very rich people, because there are millions of 50-gallon barrels that are used around the world, and they probably account for more wine spoilage than all the Acetobacter that you can think of. Viticulture is practiced very well, and I think that helps the quality of the wines. We don't take very good care of some of our vineyards in California. Much as we are proud of them and should be proud of them, there are a lot of vineyards in California that have weeds in them and so forth. Some of the larger wineries down the valley have taken to grading the vineyards, A, B, C. And the A vineyards are the ones that don't have weeds in them. I think this makes some sense. Where we're in a moisture-deficient ecology, the idea of getting rid of weeds makes good sense to me. There's one exception to that. Anybody know what the exception is? It's right over here at Florin. Over at Florin, the best Tokais grew in the areas where they had lots of weeds. They kept the moisture content down so the Tokais would get nice and red in the fall. So the growers used to go out, or the buyers, the shippers used to go out and pick the Tokais from the weedy vineyards. But that was sort of a rice weed and had a very specialized thing. In general, weeds don't belong in vineyards. Well, I've already talked about the legal restrictions. 9% is the minimum alcohol, and 10% for the district wines. The per acre production is about 30 to 35 hectoliters. A hectoliter is 26 and 4/10 gallon. We'll say 27 gallons, be on the right side. And if it was, let's say it was 40, it's not quite that much. For a sec, it's 28, 8, 9, 10. That's 1,080 gallons per, let's see, wait a minute. Yes, 40 hectoliters would be 1,080 gallons in 2 acres. That's about 500 gallons per acre, which is about 3 tons. So the maximum yield is fixed at about 3 tons to the acre. Now, a word, and then we'll be finished, about, I will not get to Burgundy today. The red wines all have some varietal character. That's one of the easiest things about Bordeaux. They're not alcoholic. They all tend to be on the low alcohol side. They all have some wood character. All the red wines have some wood character, but not exceptional amount of wood character. Not nearly as much as some of the wines that have been made in the Napa Valley have had in recent years. You will have to look for the wood character. We're going to taste Bordeaux red on Friday, and you'll see that you'll have to look for it. They have very little bouquet when they're young, and it's rather hard to taste the Cabernets out of the barrel in Bordeaux. You taste them, and if you know enough to look for the alcohol, you'll get some idea of how good they are. They're very, very thin, and on the very, very tart side, well, you'll think it's going to be a thin year, and it will be a poor year. They're always dry. The only exception to the dryness in Bordeaux wines was the vintage of 1921, which was a sizzler all over Europe, and there was residual sugar in some Bordeaux wines. Some people liked them very much, and some people disliked them very much. At one time, I fell into a very pleasant group of people in Berkeley who had a large supply of 1920 and 1921 Bordeaux. And I was the only one that preferred the 20s. because they were dry. The rest of the people all preferred them slightly sweet. But the industry itself makes the Bordeaux wines dry, the red wines. The negative things about them are the fact that they are sometimes quite thin, and in the old days they used to be quite tangy, so that you would have some trouble in drinking them when they were young. That's no longer true, at least for 2/3 of them. And there can be volatile acid. Never terribly bad, but once in a while you'll find one of the modern wines, one of the lesser chateaus, where the winery people all went for a vacation in July and August, barrels were not filled, and the volatile acid crept up on them. The white wines, the sauternes, are the sweet ones. They all have the same avarietal character, same as the reds, but they also have a botrytis character, which is quite pronounced in some cases. And they do develop bouquet with age. An old sauterne has a different smell than a young bouquet. The negative factors about sauterne is that they can be too fungus-like. That's when they have too much botrytis. And the botrytis is superseded by another fungus, Aspergillus or penicillin, and so you get a fungus smell on them at the same time. And they also have too much fixed SO2 and too much free SO2 for my taste. Almost always, including Chateau Yquem. The Graves, well, Professor Berg, I agree with Professor Berg on the Graves. Just forget it. The second laboratory, the average was 87. The grades were 26.